we say thank you, because bringing us together is not about me. It is about the issue of assessing and evaluating what is the proper path for a strong Israel for the future. In the recent Parsha, it is said, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof, a mantra for the Jewish people. Justice, justice, thou shalt pursue. Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof. It's an age-old commitment of the Jewish people to seek justice. And recently in Denmark, my wife Phyllis and I had the opportunity to be with our dear friend, Rabbi Bent Melchior, who has served with such dignity in a difficult land as the chief rabbi in Denmark. And we discussed the Parsha, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof. And he explained to me an approach that he has. And I use the word approach by design. He said that it is a commitment of the Jewish people, an obligation of the Jewish people to seek justice, to achieve justice. But the fact of the matter is, achieving, he says, implies a perfection. And we, humans, no matter how hard we strive, we cannot always be expected of ourselves, nor does Hashem expect of us achieving perfection. And therefore, he says, let us not talk about achieving justice. Let us talk about approaching justice. Let we, the Jewish people throughout the world, wherever we may be located, in Israel, or in Europe, or in Latin America, or down under, or in the Americas, let us together work to achieve justice by approaching justice. And let it be good enough if we are indeed committed to a proper approach. The Hague Odyssey is essentially about Israel approaching justice. Justice for her people, justice as a nation state, justice as a member of the family of nations, justice as a member of the United Nations, and justice as the nation state of the Jewish people. Our enemies serve to deny us various rights. They serve, in spite of our passionate commitment to human rights, to deny us of the good name of being advocates of human rights. They choose to push aside our long-standing commitment to social justice, our long-standing commitment to civil rights, our long-standing commitment to equality, and our long-standing, unbreakable commitment to the dignity of all men and women and all humans without regard to their race or creed or color or national origin or their religion or their beliefs of any kind or practices. The Jewish people are indeed committed to justice, and therefore one must ask, with that commitment, do we not deserve fair justice? Do we not deserve the opportunity to be enjoying our good name? The people of the book we were called. Today we are called, I'm sorry to say, words that the ambassador cannot dignify, but that I will address. We are called an apartheid, racist, criminal state. And indeed, enemies at the United Nations have for decades been working to build the platform to where the good name of Israel will not be seen as the good name of Israel, but rather will be seen as the name of those apartheid, racist criminals who treat other people badly. This has been a long campaign. If we just look at the United Nations, and we don't need to go all the way back to 1947 at the Partition Resolution, or to 1948 with the declaration of Israel's independence, or the subsequent acceptance by Israel as a full member state of the United Nations. Let's take a look at the time period of the mid-70s. What became the mantra work at the United Nations? To classify Israel under the banner of Zionism, which is the proud movement for independence of the Jewish people, historically seeking return to our homeland with pride and with determination and with a proper plan, not to take from anyone else, but to reassert and reestablish our rights. The Zionism racism resolution actually was adopted at the United Nations. It became a flag-waving ceremony. It became an opportunity to use forums and to use speeches and to use writing and to use the platform to bash Israel. And so when we look, for example, at the conferences that were held, and I reflect specifically on the 1985 Nairobi Conference, the United Nations Conference called to assess and appraise the status of women. This was not a conference that was about women. It was a conference called about women, but when we met in Nairobi at the Nairobi Hebrew Congregation with all of the various Jewish organizations and with security from Israel and from our own organizations, we were kept on the grounds of the Nairobi Hebrew Congregation, and we were given security in our homes in Nairobi because they were afraid to put us in hotels. And this was in 1985 because that conference to assess and appraise the status of women, held on the United Nations ground and under the auspices of the United Nations, indeed became the worst violent, virulent, anti-Semitic experience that we, the Jewish people, some would say, have seen since the Shoah itself, because it was a renewal of public attacks on the good name of Israel and the Jewish people. And when we walked in the forum grounds of the United Nations, there were tables with four-color posters about Israel murdering babies, and Israel taking blood from babies, and Israel doing this and doing that, including killing people and keeping them in refrigerators so that their blood could be used for Passover. What else happened in 1985, around this same time period? The Egypt Air Flight 648 was hijacked. November 1985. This was a hijacking by the Abu Nidal terrorist organization under the sponsorship of Libya and the sponsorship of Syria. And what did they do on that airplane? When it landed in Malta after a shootout with the Egypt Air Marshals, they collected everybody's passports. This was a flight going not to Israel, not from Israel. This was a flight going from Athens to Cairo. They collected passports, and they were letting people off the airplane, one country at a time, one group at a time. But they took the 2 Israeli women and the 3 Americans and they put them in first class. And there came a moment when they called forward the first Israeli woman. She reached out for her passport and they put a gun to her head and blew out her brains in front of the other Israeli woman and the 3 Americans. And as Malcolm has told you, we have worked in the courts of the United States to hold Libya responsible, to hold Syria responsible for this Abu Nidal terrorist organization attack, and make no mistake about it. The target of that attack was not just Israel or Israelis or Jews. It was all Americans and America. And the 3 Americans who took bullets in the brain, not one of them were of the Jewish faith. But they had their day in court when they stood up in a court in the United States. And 1 month later, in Rome and in Vienna, there were Abu Nidal attacks on the LL and TWA counters, and Kalashnikovs were sprayed. And I've interviewed the Abu Nidal surviving terrorist, and I said, what were your instructions? And the instructions were, kill the Jews, kill the Americans, and the instructions were, see if we could get a pilot and fly an airplane and crash it into Tel Aviv. 1985, air marshals. I'm not talking about post 9/11. I'm talking about 1985. And from then until now, at the United Nations, not one country has ever apologized. Not one country has ever said to Israel, you deserve equality, so we're going to put you in the proper regional grouping of the United Nations that will entitle you to sit on the Security Council of the United Nations. And Israel alone cannot sit on the Security Council because she doesn't have, in the minds of the United Nations, the right credentials. The Hague Odyssey focuses in on the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, which are based in The Hague, near Amsterdam. And at those courts, here's what happened. At the request of the United Nations General Assembly, an advisory opinion was requested by the General Assembly, bypassing the Security Council, to issue an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, the UN's court, on the issue of the legality of Israel's wall. They don't give it the regard of Israel's terrorism prevention security fence. They call it the wall. And the plan to call it the wall was to build the case of an apartheid wall, giving the impression of apartheid in South Africa, giving the impression of the Berlin Wall, as you've heard, not giving any regard to the fact that countries around the world have walls, not any regard to the fact that the Great Wall of China is not merely a decorative historical wall, but it was built for defense. The International Court of Justice accepted jurisdiction of the request to issue an advisory opinion. Israel objected, the United States objected, Canada objected, other countries objected, but in fact there was entered in 2004, there was rendered an advisory opinion. And those of us who worked in The Hague and who participated with victims of terrorism at the old City Hall while they were deliberating at the Peace Palace in The Hague, those of us who were able to call together Israeli victims of terrorism to testify at the old City Hall in The Hague near a burned out bus that we brought to The Hague. Those of us that were there will remember, if nothing else, one father who stood up in front of the members of the European Parliament who were present, and he put his hand in his pocket and he pulled out not glasses, he pulled out a bullet. And he says, this is the bullet that went through my child's eye. And he cried. And we cried. And the members that were present from the European Parliament and the Dutch Parliament cried. And maybe for the first time they got it. That the terrorism prevention security fence built by Israel during the raging Second Intifada was not to create a border, was not to create a wall, was not to create separation, but was designed and reluctantly implemented and built for the purpose of creating security for Israel, for the Jewish people, for all Israelis, and for the Palestinians themselves living near the terrorism prevention security fence, otherwise referred to as the wall. So let me fast forward, if I may, before I conclude. What has happened since? This advisory opinion has no force of law in international law, but it's already being cited by courts. And it's being cited in UN resolutions. And there are requests to list the damages that the wall has caused. I have a friend whose name I won't use who was hauled before a criminal court in a European country for his company having provided equipment for the construction of the terrorism prevention security fence. When we filed on behalf of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a Washington-based nonprofit organization, the brief with the International Court of Justice, we set forth a simple proposition. Every nation, state in the world, including Israel, has the right and the obligation to defend her people. Every nation, state in the world, including Israel, has the right and the obligation to defend her people. For the United Nations, for any member of the United Nations, for the International Court of Justice, for any court anywhere to deny Israel or any country in the world that basic governmental obligation to stand up proudly, with dignity, and with determination for her people. Anyone who doesn't get it does not deserve to malign Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu says often, Israel lives in a dangerous neighborhood. Prime Minister Netanyahu said at the United Nations in the last 2 years, Israel will do everything we can and must do to protect and defend our people. It is the basic, and I paraphrase, obligation of a government. Ladies and gentlemen, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Justice, justice, thou shalt pursue. Israel, like every other nation state in the world, as a member of the family of nations, as a member of the United Nations, as a country and people who are committed to justice for all people, Israel has the right, even more than the obligation, the right to defend her people. And the Hague Odyssey will help walk you through that dastardly advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. And in the end, when you conclude, I hope you will realize that Israel, in exercising her right to stand up proudly and strongly for Israel and all the Jewish people, is the basic right and obligation of every country in the world, and a right and obligation through its commitment to justice that Israel takes seriously. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Thank you very much.